Hey guys, it's Kayla, also known as KayKay Too Loud. Today I wanted to talk about the PowerA Fusion Pro 2 Xbox controller versus the Xbox Elite Series 2 controller. I know I'm really late to the party when it comes to a comparison video, but I recently got my hands on both these controllers, so I thought it'd be useful to share my feedback and experience gaming with them, especially since I have never used a pro controller ever since I was a kid until about 2 months ago. And before I begin, I just want to say this is my very first comparison video I've ever done, so have mercy on my soul. Let's get started. So the first thing I wanted to go over is what comes with the Fusion Pro 2 versus what comes with the Elite Series 2. Let's take a look. The Fusion Pro 2 comes with 2 additional thumbsticks and a white interchangeable faceplate, while the Elite Series 2 comes with 4 additional thumbsticks, one being that taller thumbstick, the traditional D-pad, a thumbstick tension adjustment tool, and a charging dock. I do favor the case for the Fusion Pro 2 over the Elite Series 2. I like that it's a little bulkier so it's not pressing down on those thumbsticks when the case is closed. Whereas with the Elite Series 2, when the case is closed, I can tell that it's really pressing down on those thumbsticks. And I know that these controllers are prone to getting stick drift eventually, so you'd think that they would consider that when designing a case for the controller, especially a controller being $180. But one thing I did really like about the Elite Series 2 case is that the charging block fits in the case, so you can keep your controller in the case and then all of your extra attachments are easily accessible. Whereas with the Fusion Pro 2, I wasn't disconnecting the controller and putting it in the case after each use, so I ended up not even using the case and it kind of just sat in the corner. So let's talk about weight and feel of the two controllers. So when I first decided I wanted to go with the Pro controller, I didn't really think about the weight being something like a noticeable problem, but right away when I switched over to the Fusion Pro 2, I noticed that it was a lot heavier than my standard Xbox controller, and that didn't really bug me, but it was just like something different, like the bulkiness and then the extra weight just playing. I don't know, it just kind of felt a little weird to me. And then when I switched over to the Elite Series 2, I noticed that that one was a lot lighter than the Fusion Pro. It was just something that I didn't really consider that maybe you'd want to think about when you're deciding between the two controllers. Both of these controllers have grips. I did personally favor the grips on the Elite Series 2 over the Fusion Pro 2. I mean, we all get the sweaty hands once in a while we're playing, and I feel like the Elite Series 2, the controller just like stayed in my hands a lot better than with the Fusion Pro. I especially noticed this when I was using the paddles. So when I was using all 4 paddles on the Fusion Pro 2, I noticed that the controller would occasionally slip in my hands, and I have not yet experienced that problem with the Elite Series 2. Now let's talk about the triggers and the 3-way trigger stop. So both of these controllers have the customizable 3-way trigger stop. With the Fusion Pro 2, I noticed that it was not as noticeable as it is when you're adjusting on the Elite Series 2. So for example, when I was using the Fusion Pro 2, I had the trigger stop set at the shortest stop, and then when I switched over to the Elite Series 2, I did the same thing, and the trigger stop was so much shorter on the Elite Series 2. So I ended up switching over to the middle stop just because it felt more comfortable and it was something I was already used to. With the Elite Series 2, you can calibrate the triggers through the app. I personally haven't done this and I don't know anything about it, but if you have and you want to give me your feedback, feel free to do so in the comments below. One final thing I wanted to note about the triggers between the two controllers, and not that this is a huge drawback for the Fusion Pro 2, but I really liked how the Elite Series 2 has grips on their triggers. It's not super noticeable, but as I mentioned before, sometimes you get sweaty hands and the grips don't hurt when you're in a stressful situation. Now let's talk about the thumbsticks. So both of these controllers come with the swappable thumbsticks. With the Elite Series 2, you get that taller thumbstick, which I'm sure you know is for more precise aiming. I actually tried using the tall thumbstick for the first time and my aiming was horrible. So I ended up switching back to that shorter thumbstick. And once I get more comfortable with the controller, I feel like I'll definitely try to use the tall thumbstick again. But for now, I'm just kind of enjoying getting used to those extra paddles on the back. One last thing to note about the thumbsticks between the two controllers is that you can adjust the stick tension with the Elite Series 2. I didn't mind not having this feature when I was using the Fusion Pro 2, but I do like that it's another way that you can customize your controller. Now let's talk about the most important feature between these two controllers, for me anyways, the paddles. The Elite Series 2 paddles are very stable, they don't easily fall out, and they're in a much better position on the back of the controller versus the Fusion Pro 2. When I first got the Fusion Pro 2, I was super excited to try out the extra paddles, so I automatically tried using all 4. But the placement was so awkward for my fingers that I felt like I was getting carpal tunnel syndrome while I was playing. With the Elite Series 2, I feel like the paddles are more snug and their placement doesn't feel as awkward for my fingers, so I think eventually I will try using all 4 paddles again. One thing I noticed with the Fusion Pro 2 was that the paddles were extremely sensitive and they were way easier to accidentally press, which actually annoyed the hell out of me when I first started using the controller because I was constantly pressing buttons on accident. There was a few times I'd be in a firefight on Modern Warfare 2 and I would accidentally hit the reload button, and you can't cancel reload, so I would automatically be screwed, which just really frustrated me, which is why I ended up taking off the lower 2 paddles and just playing with the upper 2. And since the Fusion Pro 2 was the first controller I've ever used with paddles on the back, I felt like it wasn't necessarily a bad thing to get used to using just 2 paddles to start. But one of the most annoying things about the paddles on the Fusion Pro 2 was how easily they fell out. Why do they fall out so easily? I don't get it. When I first started using the Fusion Pro 2, I would accidentally bump a paddle in the wrong way and then it would just fall out. And I would be in the middle of a match and then I'm trying to quickly scramble to put the damn paddle back in. It was so frustrating. I have not experienced anything like that with the Elite Series 2, and I'm sorry I'm getting so heated, but my God, that was one thing that really pissed me off with the Fusion Pro 2. One other thing I really like about the Elite Series 2 versus the Fusion Pro 2's paddles was when I would set the Fusion Pro 2 in my lap, it would be pressing the paddles like on my leg. And it'd be like randomly joining matches and I wouldn't even be at my Xbox. I'd like set my controller down to like go and like grab a snack or something, and then I'd come back and I'm like in a match and I'm like, oh, okay. I never have had that problem with the Elite Series 2. I actually noticed it last night and I decided to add this to my video, but I set it on my lap or like right on top of my leg and I was like, oh my gosh, it doesn't accidentally hit the buttons. How great is that? So one thing to think about with that. Let's talk about mapping the paddles. So with the Elite Series 2, you can map the paddles through the app. I found it a little confusing at first, but I just watched a handy dandy YouTube video and I figured it out pretty quick. I really like with the Fusion Pro 2 how you literally just press a button and then you can map the paddles. One thing I did notice though was occasionally the Fusion Pro 2 would disconnect from my Xbox even though it was plugged in, and then it would forget the profile settings that I already had set. Luckily for me, it was really easy to remap the paddles with, again, just a push of a button, so it didn't bug me that much, but it was an inconvenience to say the least. One drawback with the Fusion Pro 2 is that you don't have those different paddle profiles, which you do have with the Elite Series 2. You have 3 different paddle profiles to work with, so if you're changing between different types of game modes, it's really convenient. So just to recap my overall opinion on the pros and cons of each controller, with the Elite Series 2, it has more customizable features. The paddle placement feels more natural with your fingers. The paddles seem sturdy and they aren't easy to accidentally press, and they don't fall out. The weight of the controller and the grips feel more comfortable in your hands, especially for you sweaty hand players like myself. The overall build just feels like a nicer quality controller. The adjustable stick tension and trigger stops work great. I love that it's wireless and the charging station is a plus. When setting the controller in your lap, it doesn't push the buttons, and having different paddle profiles is always a plus. The things I didn't like about the Elite Series 2: for the money, I feel like this controller shouldn't have the occasional paddle failure, which I did notice from time to time. Mapping the buttons through the app can be annoying as hell, especially when you're in the middle of a game and you want to switch something up quick. And coming from someone who has played with the basic controller her whole life and who has had success gaming with those basic controllers, the price for the Elite Series 2 of $180 is overpriced in my opinion for how fragile the controller is. For the Fusion Pro 2, I really like the price tag of $80. It was a great starter controller, and if you're looking for an alternative to those high price tag Pro controllers, this is also a great option. It's super easy to map the paddles on the fly with just a push of a button. I like that the controller is not too complicated, and it can be considered more reliable because it has less features that can potentially fail. Although it is a little bulky, it still feels comfortable in your hands. I like that it has an interchangeable faceplate. It's a fun way to customize your controller, and I was actually excited about that when I first got the controller. And you get cool stickers with the controller. I mean, you can't go wrong with that. What I didn't like about the controller, the headset jack failed twice on me with two separate controllers. The first controller I got, the headset jack failed within a week of using the controller, and the second controller's headset jack failed after just a month of use. And keep in mind, this happened with normal use of the controller. I'm not one of those gamers that go super hard on her controllers, and I do really take care of my stuff because $80 is still a lot of money. The controller is wired, which isn't a big deal because my headset is wired, and what's one more wired? It just wasn't ideal when I was switching from a wireless controller to a wired controller. I would randomly get disconnected from my console, and I would have to remap the paddles every time this happened. The paddles would easily fall out, and again, this is the thing I hated the most about this controller, and they were way too easy to accidentally press. The paddle placement was very uncomfortable when using all 4 paddles, so I opted to using only 2. You didn't have multiple paddle profiles, and lastly, when setting the controller down, it was super easy to press those paddles on the back. Overall, for the money, the Fusion Pro 2 was a great starter Pro controller, and I would definitely recommend it for beginners. But after using the Elite Series 2, I would definitely have a hard time going back. Thank you guys so much for watching. This is my very first comparison video, so if you do have feedback for me, please let me know what you think in the comments below, and I hope to see you on the next one.